The numbers, the NFU claiming one figure, the government disputing that.
Yeah, the farmers are on the streets because Rachel Reeves wants to change inheritance tax rules. Specifically, she wants to make farms, for the first time since the 1980s, subject to inheritance tax. Now, nobody likes inheritance tax. Actually, very few people have to pay it, around 4%. But until now, farmers haven't had to pay at all. And that's because they get full relief, 100% relief as it's known, under two categories that can apply to a farm. Agricultural property relief, this is the number the government has lent on, that applies to land, to farm buildings, woodland, that kind of thing, but also business property relief. That's your livestock, cereals, the product you make, farm equipment, crucially, and anything you've done to diversify the farm. So cottages that have become holiday lets. They've all been free of inheritance tax entirely. Now, that is going to change, and the Chancellor is going to bundle together those two areas of relief and give much more limited thresholds. £1 million for every farmer. That can rise to £1.5 million because everybody gets about £500,000 of inheritance tax relief. Now, if there's a couple who are married and passing on the farm jointly, that can raise to £3 million before you have to pay any tax. The Prime Minister's used that number, the most favourable one, this morning. And then the inheritance tax will be 20%, not the 40% the rest of us would have to pay, and it's payable over 10 years. Now, the argument has been from government that about a quarter of farms will be affected and only a handful of farmers will actually pay it. They base it on that agricultural property relief. These are actual claims made by farmers in 2021, and they're banded, we can see, by the value of the estate. What we're interested in is farms that get above that £1 million figure, above the new thresholds. And the Chancellor and Treasury say you add up those categories above £1 million, I can break it down a bit more, just 462 claims in a single year. Now, that's actual deaths and estates that have been passed on. Quite a small number. Of course, not every farmer is going to be claiming every year. The National Farmers Union say, in fact, the figure that could be affected, potentially above that threshold, is much, much larger. This is the net worth of farms, figures from the Department of the Environment, Farming and Rural Affairs, so official figures. Look, 10% of farms are worth less than £250,000. But look, net worth, almost half, 49%, this black bar, are worth £1.5 million or more. And that is why the National Farmers Union say that these are farms in England. That's about potentially 45,000, 50,000 farms could be affected. And that's where the discrepancy lies. Essentially, it's an argument between farmers who are actually have died and passed on their estates and those that potentially could. Two more things to say, if there's time. What's the government trying to do here? It's trying to deal with the people who are sheltering wealth in farming because of those 100% tax relief. This is who's been buying farmland over the last, this is from big land agents over the last 10 years. The red bar here is people who describe themselves as farmers, family farmers, and we might call them. This year, in the first 3 quarters, just 31% of land has been bought by people who say they're farmers. The rest has been bought by lifestyle investors, private investors. You might think of lifestyle, Jeremy Clarkson, we saw him, Alex James, the former Blur basis. They have moved on to farms. And institutional investors at the top here. So investors and those who are deploying money they've made elsewhere in farming outnumber actual farmers buying land. This has become, the government was essentially a tax shelter they want to address. The challenge is where you set the bar so you don't catch these farmers who are asset rich in their land and their equipment, but they are cash poor. Let's just look at just how quite cash poor they are. This is numbers for croppable farms, horticulture, arable land. Like this is farm business profits over the last 4 years. Look at the year 2023 to 2024. Profits, average profits, so that's from the largest multi-million pound estates to the smallest small holding, less than £50,000 of profit, less than half of the year before. It's been a dreadful year for British farms. And the argument is if you've got an inheritance tax bill of £2 million over 10 years, that's still £20,000 a year. Even for an average farm, that's getting on for half your profit. And so the only option might be to sell. Of course, you will have the proceeds of a farm that's land product is worth a lot of money. So this is relative pain. But the argument is, of course, that land might go out of cultivation, or it might go on to those institutional investors that the government has been trying to tax. The issue all here is all about where you set the bar and who suffers under potential inheritance tax claims.
And Paul, that's the really interesting thing here, isn't it? That when you look at those figures, and what I've taken away from what you just said, is that there are a lot of people, wealthy people, buying land at the moment in the UK who are not going to be farmers because they want to avoid paying inheritance tax. And, you know, there are small farmers affected, but at the end, the government is saying that this is also taking them on, if you like, as well.
Precisely, and this is, if you ask any tax lawyer, if there is 100% relief from any tax, that is where they will look to send money. I mean, Jeremy Clarkson, he's become the front man for these protests, and he has made arguments that farmers have supported about the realities of the farming industry in his television show. But he said himself, one of the attractions of buying the farm, which was losing money and still does on its own terms, was that there was no inheritance tax. So money has poured in to this area. Now, much of that land remains in cultivation. It is producing food. The business model is just bigger. But the government is trying to address this sheltering of wealth, and how we deal with wealth taxes, of course, is a real challenge because they're treated differently to income. For example, one of the issues here is that land increases in value, right? So that's pushing up the value of farms, and it's going to push, as time goes on, the value of that land rises. It will push more farms up above those thresholds. But there's an argument that land accrues value, but it doesn't face capital gains tax currently. Now, other gains you might make from business property, you will have to pay. So there's a real balance here, and much of it comes back to this. What do we mean by family farm? We all have an idea in our heads of where we'd like our food to come from and the kind of people, hard-working, passing farms to the generation. But the reality in an industry, in a farming economy that is so strained and produces such small profits and revenue from those who are earning the money, is that setting that bar in a way that protects the right kind of farm but delivers, prevents people hiding wealth the Exchequer thinks they're due a slice of. That is fearsomely difficult. Wherever this line had been set, and the Conservatives who've been asked to do this by the Treasury in the past have said this number is way too low and they resisted it, wherever it was set, there was bound to be complaint. But ultimately, it's about making that judgment. Treasury thinks it will raise, at best, £500 million. The question, ultimately, I'm guessing, politically, will be whether that is a price worth paying.
And just very finally and quickly, Paul, if you can, on that, what we're hearing today from the Treasury, from the government, is they are not going to U-turn on this. Absolutely
right. The language appears to be they're holding firm. The Chancellor put out a statement this morning in response to these protests. Some of the arguments are familiar. The black hole in the public finances, everyone needs to do their bit. They're talking about the money they are putting into farming. But at the moment, it feels like this is a row they're willing to have and weather, but don't all political U-turns start that way. I'm not qualified to say which way it will go, but at the moment, it seems that the Treasury is going to stick to its guns and farmers will have to wear this. OK, Paul, great analysis. Thank you very much indeed, Paul Kelso there, our economics and business correspondent live in Westminster. Well, let's speak to Jeremy Moody now. He's Secretary and Advisor to the Central Association of Agricultural Valuers, which actually values farm estates. As I say, there's been a lot of confusion, a lot of disputes about the numbers in this. Jeremy, as far as you understand it, how many farms do you think could be caught up in these changes?
I think we're being misled by a number of things here. The first is that the figures the government were relying on during the budget debate was simply those who were claiming agricultural property relief. So that's just land and buildings and dwellings. It excludes the livestock, the machinery, the crops in store and everything else. And that's a very significant part of the value of a farming business, and that was ignored. So the first figures that came out were misleading to that extent. Also misleading because they include a lot of land that has been bought by people who are relatively or more wealthy that is below the £1 million threshold. Those will remain, of course, protected by the £1 million threshold, but those people below that are not necessarily farmers. We had paperwork out last night from the Treasury looking at some of the BPR analysis, and it's hard to do. But on the basis of looking through those figures quickly, and looking at people expecting to pay tax, because it's not just that number of 400 or 500 a year that we're looking at. If we add more for BPR, the business property relief on livestock and the rest, and then think about this over a generation. The taxpayers who are likely to die with farm assets over that period, even on the government figures, you get to something like 20,000. And we think the government are underestimating the exposure of farm businesses to this. When an average cereals farm has a net worth of 3.1 million after debts, that requires 4 owners to meet the government's challenge.
In saying that, I mean, the Chancellor has said there are further exemptions beyond that £1 million figure, up to 3 million if it's passed on to children and it's owned by a married couple, which I assume would be quite a few of these farms. As in, there are exemptions beyond that much talked about £1 million figure.
Yeah. The answer to that is yes and no. There are those other nil rate bands. There's the first 325,000 that any taxpayer gets. And that is there, firstly, to cover all your personal effects. You essentially have to be a monk with no personal assets to be able to bring your agricultural business and land into that 325,000. So it's there, but not there. It will get used on other things. And then the second 175,000 is if you have occupied a house that you wish to give to a descendant, which of course is not always true in every case. A tenant farmer living in the tenant farmhouse would have no ability to pass that house down. And once you're looking at an estate above 2 million, you start losing that 175,000 immediately. So it's a misleading, it's an attempt to provide a simple, reassuring answer for something that's simply not as neat as that, and does assume that you've got absolutely nothing else in your life bar your tractor.
But in saying that, I mean, the government would turn around and say they're trying to be fair here. They've put up taxes on pretty much every business in this country. They would argue to plug the public finances. That's a different political argument. But they would say it's about fairness. Farming is already subsidised, and that this is making a less generous package for farmers, a very generous package for farmers, a little less generous. That's true, isn't it?
Well, I think there's a point here to make that actually the government's changes are increasing the tax burden on all privately owned family businesses, whether farming or otherwise. It's simply that APR is in the mix alongside the business property relief that a printer, a pub, a livestock market, an accountancy firm could all claim. But moving back into this, I think the government intended probably that this be a relief for, as you've said, the small family farm. They've simply misunderstood what is a small family farm these days with the kind of economics that your correspondent was outlining. They've simply come in too low for their own purpose and are digging in on data that does not describe reality.
Okay. Do you think they'll have to U-turn on this?
Well, have to is rather imperative. It would be easier if they found a way to resolve this among the larger problems they've created in terms of the taxation of business that generates wealth in this country. Those are political decisions they have to make. This is the fuse that has lit farming reaction in a way we haven't seen in this country for well over a century.
Okay, wow. Jeremy, appreciate that. Jeremy Moody there joining us from the Central Association of Agricultural Valuers. Thank you. Let's stick with this story. I say only one real story in time today. Let's speak to Rob Hitch. He is an accountant at Dodd & Co, who specialises in farming. Rob, very good morning to you. Let's kind of look at this on a wider picture if we can. There is a big argument today that lots of farmers are asset wealthy, but they are cash poor, if you like, because their margins are massively squeezed. And fundamentally, isn't that the problem here? It's not actually the argument about inheritance tax. That is an argument. But it's about the fact that farmers struggle, and they struggle because we all expect to have cheap food in this country. Isn't that the kind of big macro discussion that we should be having?
Quite possibly. I mean, you could argue that land prices have been way out of kilter with the earning capacity for a very long time, and we're in a position now whereby some farmers may face an IHT liability. If we look at our businesses, probably, like the NFU analysis, there's probably 50% of them at least, I would think, would pay IHT if they hold all the assets at death. I suppose the key thing is, does that actually happen? A lot of business owners pass assets down during lifetime, which you can do relatively easily. And that probably minimise the risk to a lot of businesses.
I suppose what I'm trying to get at here, Rob, is there'll be a lot of people watching, a lot of people who run businesses, a lot of people who've got money, some people who don't, who say, well, we all have to pay inheritance tax if we're wealthy enough to do so. Why is farming special? Why should farming be any different?
I don't think it's farming. Farming gets a special relief in that it gets agricultural property relief, but it gets the same relief as businesses, which they've had for 40 years as well. So it is protecting wealth generation and business assets that are within people's hands. Now, in most cases, it is possible to pass those down during lifetime, but they become potentially exempt transfers. So you've given it away, you must survive 7 years before it drops out of your estate. Now, if you're young enough, you can insure against that. But the change to the rules today effectively means that if you gave something away on the 29th of October, you're fine. And if you gave something away on the 30th of October, you're not. Now, if you're 60, that's probably doable. If you're 75 or 80, that's a terrible position to find yourself in. And you just think the government haven't sort of foreseen some of the problems that these rules might create for people that have followed one, been playing on under one set of rules for 40 years and then suddenly found themselves under another. Okay. I don't think the farmers I speak to, I don't think they're completely antagonistic about if this is a tax that's here and we have to plan around it, and it's one of those risks that the business takes on, and we have to plan and make decisions in good time. But there are a certain cohort of people who will not have that time to do it. This will collect most tax from people who die in the next 7 years, most of which are over 70 already. And that, I can't imagine that is what the government intended.
Yeah. So it's essentially the lack of consultation, I think, is kind of what you're trying to say about this. Just finally, Rob, we've heard from Jeremy Clarkson saying if this continues on, it is over for farming. We see people there talking about the death of the family farm, some suggesting that this will kill off farming in this country. Is that hyperbole? I mean, it sounds to me like it's hyperbole. You talk to farmers, you deal with them. I mean, is this the death nail for family farming in this country?
I can't see it being that. People want to farm and people will continue to farm and people will continue to pass farms down. They just won't be able to do it as freely on death. So they will need a lot more planning. There'll have to be a lot earlier discussions about succession, which maybe some other businesses do, which is why we're not hearing so much, uproar from the wider business community about the BPR changes. But it will hurt a certain cohort, generally old people who can't make gifts and survive 7 years. And that seems brutal. And as I say, probably needs to have some sort of change. And the government, you would hope, would see some sense in providing a sort of window for those sort of people to not find them. Because we're going to find some farms, as you point out, if there is an IHT charge, they don't generate enough cash necessarily to pay that bill.
Okay.
Even paying it over 10 years, some of them might have a problem. Well, the last thing I suspect the government want is a number of farms being sold that were in a generation for three generations of farms, and the guys died at 80 and there's an IHT charge. Whereas if he'd given it away on the 29th of November, nothing would have happened.
Okay.
So that's the real problem.
Okay. Really fascinating stuff. And we will be hearing from the NFU at those protests in Westminster a little later on this morning. Rob, for now, thank you very much indeed. Rob Hitch there joining us. I'm just going to bring you some breaking news away from what's happening with those protests, and that is from Bristol, actually, and that is that the getaway driver, Anthony Snook, 45, has been jailed at Bristol Crown Court for life, with a minimum term of some 38 years for the murders of teenagers Mason Rist and Max Dixon during a machete attack. So that is Anthony Snook has been jailed for a minimum of 38 years. For the murders of 2 teenagers. We'll have more on that with Wilf coming up at midday. You're watching Business Live, though. We're going to take a quick break. Up next, we'll have the latest, continuing our coverage of that farmers' protest in Westminster today. Stay tuned.
It's like a football final with only one team on the pitch. This isn't just a call to vote, but a call to remember. The freedom fought for by the African National Congress.
I'm Yusra Al-Bagher, Sky's Africa correspondent based in Johannesburg, South Africa.
A cyclone and 2 burst dams wiped out hundreds of generational homes.
This was the second dam that the floodwaters hit before it tore into Derna. We are in the heart of Nairobi, and we're watching as protesters were heavily tear gassed.
The sheer fearlessness and persistence of these guys is astonishing.
We help you understand the world with us. I remember going into the iconic Durman market in the heart of Sudan's capital for the first time since the war started. And this is what's left of it. Bullet holes through buildings, shelled balconies, bullet cases on the floor. I witnessed the complete destruction of a place linked to my childhood memories and the lives of millions of people. This is insane. This was a bustling residential area. So many friends who lived here. My most memorable interview was with a 15-year-old boy who'd survived being stranded on a migrant boat on its way from Senegal to the Canary Islands.
After 13 days, our food, water, and fuel supply ran out.
I felt awe when we saw the mountain gorillas in Rwanda.
We call him the king of the jungle. This is the alpha silverback.
Sky News. Get the full story first. Yusra Al-Bagher, Sky News.
There's always more to the news than a headline. We want to discover, to delve a little deeper, to find out what's really going on. Explanation, analysis, the people at the heart of every story. I'm Neil Patterson, and this is the Sky News Daily Podcast. So, by the end, we'll hopefully all understand what's going on in the world just that little better. Available wherever you get your podcasts.
Very welcome back to Business Live. Let's return to our big story that we're covering this morning, those developing protests in Westminster by farmers. Well, the head of the National Farmers Union has told Sky News that his members feel betrayed by the government after saying last year that they wouldn't change the tax rules. Let's have a listen in.
They simply have to move on this. The policy they've designed is very, very poorly thought through. The foundations of the numbers behind it are questionable, even DEFRA, and the Treasury can't agree on them. And then when we look at the human impact of this policy, they've designed a policy which has got the elderly generation in the twilight of their careers absolutely in the centre of this policy with no way to plan for it. They've given everything to this country to produce the food the country needs, and they can't plan their way through it. That is simply unacceptable.
As I say, thousands of farmers are gathering in Westminster today. They are saying that this is effectively the death of the family farm, given these inheritance tax changes that will make a significant difference. They argue to thousands of farmers. The government argues, actually, it's more like hundreds of farms. But effectively, the agricultural states will now have to pay 20% inheritance tax above a new £1 million threshold. And that's why they've taken to the streets in Westminster. Well, let's speak to Victoria Vivian, who's president of the Country Land Business Association, and joins us. Victoria, thank you for joining us. The big argument or the big discussion today is about the numbers that we've talked about. What's the feeling amongst farmers? How angry are they this morning?
I think they all feel under immense pressure. It seems like we have a government that neither knows anything about our business and cares less.
And when you say cares less, lots of people would point out farming's subsidised by taxpayers as it is, and that this is a generous system still compared to others who have to deal with inheritance tax.
That we have payments that are being made to support good food prices for people in the supermarkets. Farmers are not making vast profits at the cost of the taxpayer.
But isn't that the point then, that actually we need to be more realistic, that this shouldn't be a discussion about tax if it's about fairness? It should be about the fact that farmers just don't earn enough money for their goods. It's a wider problem, isn't it?
Well, there may well be a wider problem, but today the discussion is about tax. and whether or not farms are going to end up having to sell their land in order to pay an unfair tax.
OK, but then lots of people, but it's not, people would say it's not unfair. It's still generous compared to other people who have to deal with inheritance tax.
Well, inheritance tax is a tax on personal wealth. This is a tax on a business. And it's a business that has vanishingly small profitability. And of course, it's also a business that has very narrow kind of return on capital. So it's not a tax on personal wealth. As somebody said to me recently, you can't spend an acre.
OK, we've run out of time, Victoria, sorry, and I really wanted to speak more about this, but we have run out of time, unfortunately. Thank you very much for joining us here on Business Live this morning. As I say, those protests are continuing and our coverage will continue throughout the day. We are expecting to hear from the NFU and Jeremy Clarkson in the next hour or so. I'll be back at 4:30 with Business Live. Up next, though, it's Jane Secker with the very latest headlines. I'll see you later.
Hello, you're watching Sky News Today with me, Jane Secker. It's 12 o'clock. These are the headlines. Farmers take their inheritance tax protest to Westminster, calling for the scrapping of controversial changes announced in the budget. Among them, TV presenter and farmer Jeremy Clarkson, who delivered this message to the government.
Jeremy, what's your word to the government? You're live on Sky.